Hello, and welcome back to our series where we are building a people and culture management system. This series is brought to you by Prairie HR Solutions. My name is Jay Finger, Principal Consultant here at Prairie HR Solutions. And in this video, I would like to finally start doing something with our data. So, if you've watched the previous videos, we created a records management function to where we can create a new record, read and update that record, and archive our record. And now I would like to start building out some dashboards and ways that we can utilize that data. And I'm thinking what we can do first to start this off is to create a chart that is based on dynamic data from our spreadsheet and just have it populate here. And what I'm thinking about doing is a very simple compensation analytical graph in the form of a scatter plot, really. And what we want to do is check and plot out salaries based on experience and then identify each point whether they are male or female just to start off with. Once we get that base functionality set, then we can start adding other pieces onto it, like various different gender identities, and then also even build in filters or whatnot to allow for us to expand that based on, say, like ethnicities, age, or whatnot. That way, we can really start utilizing our data to make data driven decisions and really get a good pulse on what is occurring within our people function in our organization. Now, this isn't going to be a full in depth approach to using charts within Google Apps Script or Google, because the way we're going to have to render this on this page here is we're going to have to dip into Google Charts API essentially. And there's many different libraries that allows us to visualize data. Since we're doing AppScript through Google, we're going to go ahead and keep it with Google. If I was doing this for a different purpose or whatnot, I would use possibly a different library. And that's just a matter of preference. I have not used Google's library for charts. I typically use like something like Chart.js or even Looker Studio and then embed it into the web page. But we're going to go ahead and give it a shot with Google's API. And I'm going to try and get this done in one sitting. It may be broken up into two different episodes depending on how Google works for me anyway. Like I said, this is the first time I'll actually be using Google Charts API. And when we think about a chart, let's go over to our page or our spreadsheet here. So when we think about our data here, anytime that we want to pull a chart, what we need is rows and columns of data. So what I did was I took a tab, called it compensation, and then I just randomly grabbed things here and filled it in. And we do have within our data here, you'll see I have this box highlighted. And the reason I have this highlighted is because we added a third gender option, and that is non-binary. Now, depending on the industry reporting or whatnot, the situation, these may be broken down even further. Just to get it functional, we're going to stick with 2 initially, and then we can scale it up to fit this non-binary piece. And that way we can illustrate how to add on pieces as well. But for now, we're only going to focus on 2 just because it's simple. Now, if we were going to say create a chart, what we could do is simply insert a chart. And that chart, we're going to make a scatter chart. That's what we want. And we want it to look something like this. Now, we don't want to render this chart here in this web sheet or this Google sheet here. We want it to populate on our web app. And I mean, we could do this by publishing this chart and then taking that published chart and embedding it into, our web app. We can do it that way. Or what we can do is render this inside of our HTML and essentially draw and build it from this data here. That way we can keep the database clean and the web app separate from our spreadsheet as much as possible. So we want this basic concept simply over on our HTML side. Now, the one thing that we don't have, however, is this gender. So we're not actually able to, well, we are able to, we just have to do a little bit of work. We can change this to, D. But when we think about scatter plots, when we think about scatter plots, we have essentially two axes, X and a Y, and then we could assign these labels and then change it. Now, the problem when we're doing it this way, is our series likes to deal with numbers. A scatter plot likes the numbers. The data has to be in a number. So this plain text, if we were going to do it here in our Google Sheets, this text female, male, female would have to be in the form of a number, like a 0 or a 1. The great thing about doing this with Google Apps Script is it can be in plain text, and then we can just handle that in a different way. So let's go ahead and get rid of this chart. And let's grab this data and pull it over to our Google Apps Script side first. So what I did was I created an analytics Google Apps Script file, and this file is going to house all of our analytical functions for our web app. So let's start by building out a function, and we'll go through and change these functions. I just want to get it essentially functional first. And let's just be blatantly obvious with what we're calling our stuff here initially. So this one here is we are just going to get spreadsheet data. There we go. So that's the name of our function. And what we're going to want to do is create a variable to get our data. So let's just call this compensation. Wow, I spelled that all wrong. Compensation sheet. And what that sheet is going to be equal to is our spreadsheet app get active spreadsheet. And this is going to be get sheet by name. And that name is going to be the name of our tab, which is compensation. So now we can reference this variable to get some data. So let's create another variable. Let's call that data. Sorry for the very bland and original variable and functions names. We'll go back and change it later. And this data is going to be equal to this compensation sheet. And what we want to do is we want to get a range. And this range, we are going to want to start. We don't really need the last name. In fact, you know what? We can just get rid of this one. Let's just delete this column. And we want to start at row 1, column 1, and go down to the last row and include our 3 columns. So let's write that. So we're going to start at row 1, column 1. And we want to get the last row. Now remember, since we're starting at column 1, we don't want to include the header. Let's start at row 2, to remove that header, but then we're also going to have to do this piece, this -1 piece, to make up for that, and then the number of columns that we have. So we start here at row 2, column 1, go down to the last row, make up that header that we removed, and then we want to include 3 columns. And then let's get the values of this, and then let's log this variable out to remind ourselves how this is going to come to us. So we'll save it, and then we'll run it, and you'll see that it's coming to us as a 2-dimensional array. And when we look at this data, we have what appears to be a number, and then plain text. So when we think of how we're going to populate this scatter plot, those X and Y axes, they need to be in the form of a number. We want those to be in a number, and we want this piece to be in the form of a string. What we can do is come back over here to our sheet here and simply set these as a number, and then ensure this one here is as plain text. So the problem that we're going to run into, and we'll address this later on, is we are going to have to ensure that this is the proper format first. And we can do this essentially through a function. We can go through line by line and say, okay, A, or index 0, we want to set the formatting to number, and same with index 1, index 2 will be a string. But we need to ensure that this is a number, or it's not going to render. And you'll see why once we start building out our client side piece, is we are going to need to make sure this is a number, because that's what it is expecting. It can't plot a string when it comes to a scatter plot or a scatter chart. Okay, so let's go back here to our code. So now what we need to do here is we need to map this and essentially build an object. So if you remember, an object looks a little something like this. It has a key, and then it has a value. And this is what we're going to need to take that 2-dimensional array in and create. And we can do that through a map. So what we can do is we can take this data. Let's just make it a variable now. And let's just call that variable test. That'll be fine. And what we're going to do is we're going to take that data and we're going to map it. Now what this map is going to need is a callback function, and let's just use our arrow function. And we're going to want to focus on the row. And what this row is going to do, it's going to do a couple of things. It's going to need to create an object. And an object, if you remember, are these little curly brackets. Let's go ahead and take care of this semicolon first so I don't forget it and mess it up. Now what we can do is actually construct this object within this map. So what we can say is experience, our experience key, is essentially going to be our row 1. Oh, that's not right. It's going to be our row 0. And this is based on the assumption that experience is in column A. That's why it's at the 0. Now, if we would have had, say, that other one in there, I forgot that we deleted that column. then it would have been pushed over. But since we deleted that column, we don't need those last names, so we'll just start it at 0. So that's our experience. And then our annual pay or our salary is index 1, and then our gender is index 2. So we can build out the key values this way and assign the salary to row 1, and then our gender is row 2. There we go. And now let's go ahead and log this out. And what we should have done essentially is create an object with that data. So let's run it. And you'll see this is our 2-dimensional array containing all our data. And then what we did was created an array of objects, basically, and each object has the gender, the experience, and the salary. Now remember, object key pairs are they're kind of odd. As you can see, this first group is essentially out of order, and we ran into that when we were trying to create and read our data for our records management piece. So we had to essentially construct this. And this is fine that it comes like this, because what we can say is, in order to reference this, we would do logger log this test variable and then the experience. And then when we run that, that's essentially how we reference it. We got to give it a variable here. Of course, we got to give it an index, but that's how we reference it. We call the key, which will then give us the value. Okay, so now we have this. We don't want to store this in a variable because this function is set to return something. So let's get rid of this test and not store it in a variable. But what we want to do is return this. So it'll return that array of objects, of inner objects. So good. So now when we think about using an API for a chart, we need to go to that API and actually find the pieces of it that we need in order to start building this thing. And going back over here to our web page, we also have to think about when we want that API to run. Now, since we're using Bootstrap, you'll remember that we're using that when we called the Bootstrap package, so to speak, we put it in our header. And then the JavaScript piece was at the very end, below, right before our closing, right below our closing body tag. So our JavaScript that contained all of our Bootstrap JavaScript stuff was at the end, and then we called our overall package up here in the header. And the reason we did this was the HTML DOM, as it's called, is going to read top to bottom. So we want this to be rendered, this CSS piece to be rendered before the page loads. And then after the page loads, then we can run all this JavaScript stuff. And if you remember, our JavaScript contained our Bootstrap bundle. So when we think of our chart, we're not wanting our chart essentially to run at the very end. We don't want the page to load in this case and then try to pull up the chart afterwards. What we would like to do is have the chart run at the top before anything else runs. So we really want it to run here. And we'll populate it before we do the style sheet That way, when it populates, it won't be just bland, boring, blank HTML stuff. It will populate initially with our Bootstrap stuff. So you'll see the order of operations here in a second. But the first thing we need to do is go to our Google API. And you can simply just go to a web browser and type in Google Charts, which is exactly what I did. You'll see we have this Google chart thing. In fact, when you go to this Google chart, this is the first thing that pops up. And you can see that there's a lot of stuff in here that we can find. You'll see that we have areas, we have columns, we have lines, we have the infamous pie chart. More than likely, you will never see me do a pie chart. It's just a matter of preference. It's either going to be, for me anyway, it's either going to be a line chart, a column chart, or let's find a scatter chart here. It will be a scatter chart. So since we're trying to do a scatter chart, this is the piece that we're going to need. And you can see that we're going to have to call this stuff right here. And you'll also see that when we start drawing a chart, we are going to need it to be in a data table. And then this data table is going to need to be essentially the same concept. Well, it's going to need to be a two-dimensional array, obviously, but it's in the same concept as what we used when we built out that table for our compliance reports. If you haven't watched that video, please go back and watch that because it's the same concept. We're going to build the header, and then we're going to build each and every single row based on the information that's coming to us in that header. So we're not going to hard code this in. What we're going to do is send it dynamically from our spreadsheet. And then you'll see we're going to need these option pieces, and then our chart div, and then this. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to use this as a template, but we're going to need to do different things. So if you're following along, I would suggest having this page open, and then you'll see where I'm getting this information from and how I'm copying it over. And we'll just use pretty much the same pieces here. We're not going to use an array to a data table because what we're doing is we're using our data table dynamically from our sheet. So let's go ahead and jump in here. Let's see how much time we're burning here. Okay, so this is 23:30. So I think what we're going to do, we're at the 23 mark. I like to keep the videos down to about 30 minutes just to keep them, digestible. So what we can do is let's go ahead and end this video here. And in the next video, what we'll do is we will build out our HTML piece and then hopefully end up with a working scatter chart. So I hope you got something out of this part 1 video, and I hope to see you back for the part 2 video where we actually render a working chart. So until next time, please take care.